The sound of the Navy Band filled the air, a blend of brass and discipline, echoing across the parade ground of Naval Station Newport. The early May sunlight glinted off the water and the gold insignia pinned to my crisp white uniform. It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life. Rows of families sat behind the rope-line flags, fluttering children, fidgeting cameras ready. I had spent 18 months dreaming of this moment. When they called my name, Ensign Morgan Hale, I took one steady breath and stepped forward. I thought I saw my father's smile somewhere in the crowd. He had been gone for 5 years, but for a heartbeat, I felt him there. Then I saw her, Vivian Hale, my stepmother. Perfect posture designer sunglasses, pearls gleaming under the Rhode Island sun. She sat in the front row as if she owned the ceremony. I had not seen her since my father's funeral. Even from the stage, I could feel the chill of her stare. I told myself to ignore it. This day was mine. The master of ceremonies continued reading names, applause rising and falling in rhythm. I moved toward the microphone to give my brief address as class representative, every line memorized, every breath rehearsed. When I looked down again, Vivian was standing. Her lips were moving, and for a moment I thought she was talking to herself. Then her voice tore through the quiet. "You ungrateful little thief." It came so suddenly that the crowd froze. I blinked, not sure I had heard her right. And then I saw it. Her hands gripped the chair beside her, the scrape of metal against concrete. A flash of movement, a sound that cracked through the air. The chair hit the platform with a sharp clang before I could move. Something slammed into my shoulder and pain rippled through my vision. Gasps erupted. Someone screamed. My knees buckled, the world tilting sideways as the band stopped mid-note. The brass glinted, the sea wind carried silence, and then chaos followed. MPs rushed forward. Officers shouted. Vivian's voice, shrill and furious, cut through the confusion. "She stole my husband's legacy. She doesn't deserve that uniform." I could feel warm blood tracing down my temple, but I did not move. I forced myself upright, heels together, posture unbroken. My breath came short and sharp, but I would not collapse. Not in front of her. Not in front of them. A hand touched my arm. Someone whispered that medical was on the way, but I pushed it aside. I remember looking straight at the camera held by a journalist near the press tent. My voice came out low but steady. "She just attacked a Navy officer on base, and she will answer for it." That single sentence seemed to freeze everyone. The MPs pulled Vivian back as she kept shouting, her words dissolving into the hum of shocked whispers. A mother covered her child's eyes. A captain barked orders. The bandmaster stood motionless, baton hanging midair. I could taste iron, but the pain meant nothing compared to the burn of humiliation running through my chest. I had endured storms at sea, sleepless nights, and the brutal rhythm of OCS training. None of it compared to the sight of my stepmother turning my moment of honor into a public spectacle. As the MPs escorted her out, cameras followed. The reporters who had come to cover the graduation were now filming a scandal. I watched her go, her heels clicking against the concrete chin high, as if she had achieved victory. A drop of blood fell onto the clean white of my glove. It spread red against white, a perfect metaphor for what she had done. One of the senior officers tried to guide me off the platform, but I stayed. I lifted my chin, squared my shoulders, and saluted. The crowd hesitated, then slowly began to applaud. It was uneven at first, uncertain, but it grew, filling the courtyard with sound again. Someone near the front began to chant my name. I stood there, still bleeding, still shaking, but unmoved. Later, when I would see the footage online, the caption under the clip would read, "The calmest Navy officer I have ever seen." At that moment, I only felt cold. As the applause faded, I realized something deeper had shifted. She had not just attacked me. She had declared war on the part of me that still hoped we could ever be family. The ceremony ended, but for me, something far more dangerous had begun. "Before we continue, tell me where you are watching from." I was 13 when my world split in half. My mother, Evelyn, had been the quiet strength of our Providence home, a nurse who smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. One night in 2003, she went to work and never came back. A highway accident, they said. I remembered the look on my father's face when the officers came to the door. That expression, frozen disbelief, never left him. 6 months later, he met Vivian. She was dazzling. Red hair, tailored suits, a voice that could slice through marble. She owned a boutique real estate firm and walked as though the city itself bowed to her heels. My father said she brought life back into the house. I thought she brought a draft of cold air that never warmed again. By the time I was 16, Vivian had rearranged everything: the furniture, the finances, and my father's priorities. She handled the accounts, the trust, even the passwords. She told me my college fund was being optimized. What that meant was she controlled it. She called it responsibility. I called it ownership. My father never argued. He loved peace more than fairness. When I turned 16, Vivian decided I needed to understand the value of money. She stopped giving me allowance and said, "Find a job, a real one. You'll thank me someday." So I did. I stocked shelves at a hardware store after school, smelling of paint thinner and metal. Every paycheck I hid a few dollars in a shoebox under my bed. It was the first time I learned that independence had a cost, but it also had taste like cheap coffee and freedom. My father died in 2018. A stroke. I was 25, finishing community college, trying to get into the Navy officer candidate school. I came home for the funeral and found the house colder than I remembered. Vivian wore black silk and pearls. Her eyes were dry. When the will was read, the lawyer's voice was gentle but firm. "Everything has been transferred to the Vivian Hale Revocable Trust." My name was not mentioned. I remember my hands trembling as I asked, "What about his daughter?" Vivian smiled that quiet, poisonous smile. "Your father wanted stability, dear. I'll make sure you're supported." I walked out without another word. A month later, I enlisted. Not for revenge, not for recognition, for proof. Proof that I could build a life without the Hale money, without her permission, without anyone's pity. The Navy accepted me with a scholarship that felt like oxygen. The first months were brutal. 5 a.m. Drills, shouting instructors, cold Atlantic air burning through my lungs, but I never looked back. Discipline became my language. Pain became clarity. Every night when exhaustion blurred the edges of my thoughts, I would unfold a single sheet of paper I kept tucked in my locker. It was a letter from Vivian. She had sent it during my first month at Newport. The handwriting was perfect, the tone surgical. "You'll quit. You always do." I read it when I felt like collapsing. I memorized it until the words no longer hurt, they hardened. In 2020, during the pandemic lockdowns, our class trained under restricted conditions. No visitors, no families. I used that isolation to build the kind of focus she said I lacked. I became top of my class in naval operations, graduated with distinction, and applied to OCS. I told myself that one day, if I ever saw her again, I would not need to say a single word. My uniform would speak for me. In the rare, quiet moments between drills, I thought about my father. I wondered if he had ever realized what Vivian had done. He had trusted her, completely convinced that love and control were the same thing. Maybe he never wanted to see the difference. Sometimes, when the lights went out in the barracks, I imagined talking to him, telling him that I forgave him for being weak, but I would never forgive her for mistaking cruelty for strength. The years passed, each rank earned through sleepless nights and endless repetition. When I received the letter confirming my graduation date, May 2023, I sat on my bunk and stared at it for a long time. I imagined my father clapping from the stands, the ocean wind lifting the corner of the flag. I told myself this ceremony would finally close a circle that had started 20 years ago in a quiet Rhode Island kitchen. I did not expect her name on the guest list. A week before the ceremony, the coordinator emailed, "Mrs. Vivian Hale has confirmed attendance." I read it 3 times, certain it was a mistake. The same woman who had once told me, "You'll never represent this family," was now flying in to sit among dignitaries and officers. My first instinct was disbelief. My second was suspicion. Why now? The night before the ceremony, I found an old shoebox in my locker, the one I had kept from my teenage years, still filled with folded payslips from the hardware store. I smiled at the faded ink. Every dollar had been a rebellion, every late shift a step away from her control. I took out that same letter she had written, "You'll quit, you always do," and read it one last time. For the first time, it made me laugh. I burned it in a metal tray behind the dorms, watching the flames turn her words to ash. Then I pressed my uniform one final time, the fabric stiff and bright under the light. I thought I was closing a chapter. I didn't realize I was about to open a war. The email arrived on a gray Monday morning, 1 week before graduation. I was sitting in the mess hall at Newport, halfway through my coffee, when the subject line caught my eye. Commencement Attendance Confirmation, Mrs. Vivian Hale. For a moment, I thought I had misread it. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years. I opened the message. It was brief and polite, written by the ceremony coordinator. Your stepmother has confirmed attendance as your invited guest. My stomach tightened. I hadn't invited anyone. Guests required official clearance background checks and sponsorship through the Navy's visitor system. Someone had submitted her name and someone had approved it. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Outside, the wind off Narragansett Bay whistled through the flagpoles, and somewhere in the distance, a drill instructor's voice barked cadence. I told myself it didn't matter. She could sit quietly, clap, pretend to care, and leave. But deep down, I knew Vivian Hale never appeared anywhere quietly. That afternoon, I called my friend and classmate, Lieutenant Sarah Donnelly. She was stationed in Providence before joining the Navy and had a network of friends who heard everything worth hearing. Check if she's been talking about me, I said. There was a pause. You're not going to like the answer Sarah told me later that evening. She's been attending every fundraiser, every charity gala, telling people that you're graduating Navy and finally restoring the Hale family name. I laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. Restoring, I said. She erased me for years. Sarah sighed. She's selling that story, Morgan. The prodigal daughter returns in uniform. It's good press for her. Her real estate firm's in trouble. IRS rumors, something about a trust fund audit. That piece of information hit like a cold wave. Vivian always cared about 2 things, money and image. If her finances were under investigation, attending my graduation wasn't a family gesture. It was damage control. I didn't tell Sarah, but a part of me had always suspected that the revocable trust she used to seize my father's assets wasn't as legal as she claimed. I had no proof, only intuition. Still, the thought that she might twist my ceremony into her personal redemption tour made my skin crawl. For the next few days, I tried to focus on drills and debriefs. Newport was in full preparation mode. Flags washed uniforms, pressed rehearsals running with military precision. The graduation was more than a ceremony. It was a showcase of discipline before Admiral State officials and families. Security was tight, every guest screened. I convinced myself that whatever Vivian's motives were, she wouldn't cause a scene. She thrived on reputation. Scandals were beneath her. That was my mistake, assuming she still had boundaries. Thursday night, 3 days before the ceremony, I got a call from the event security office confirming that Mrs. Hale had passed background verification. I almost told them to revoke it, but stopped. Kicking her off the guest list would only give her another story to tell. The ungrateful daughter banned her stepmother from the Navy base. No. If she wanted an audience, she'd have one, but not the one she expected. Friday. As I left the base commissary, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. One text. Tomorrow, you'll regret everything. I stared at it, thumb hovering above the screen. It could have been spam, a prank, a wrong number, but it wasn't. It was deliberate. I deleted it. I told myself it was nothing, that the past couldn't touch me anymore. Yet the words stuck in my mind like grit in a wound. Tomorrow. That night, I couldn't sleep. The dorm lights dimmed at 2200 and silence fell except for the occasional echo of boots in the hallway. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows. It was the kind of soft, steady rain that blurs thought and memory together. I thought about my father again, about how he used to say, "Some storms you don't see coming until you're already soaked." At 0300, I got up, turned on the lamp, and went through my graduation uniform piece by piece. Each pin, each ribbon had to be perfect. I polished the insignia until it caught the light like a blade. As I folded the gloves, I noticed a faint red mark on the inside of my right wrist. an old scar from officer training. It reminded me of something Sarah once told me during a night run. "You're too calm, Morgan. The calm ones always scare the loud ones." I smiled. Maybe that was true. Maybe calm was my weapon. At dawn, I walked down to the docks behind the base. The ocean was steel gray, the air sharp with salt. Seagulls cut across the sky in uneven patterns, their cries carrying through the mist. I breathed in the cold and whispered to myself, "You made it." After 20 years of clawing out from beneath Vivian's control, I had built something no trust fund could buy. The uniform was proof, the kind that couldn't be revoked or inherited. As I turned to head back, a figure stood near the chain-link fence umbrella tilted against the wind. Even from a distance, I knew that silhouette, the precise stance, the polished heels. Vivian Hale. She wasn't supposed to be on base yet, but there she was, early waiting, watching. Her face was partly hidden by the umbrella, but I could feel her eyes tracing every movement I made. When our gazes met, she didn't smile. She just nodded once as if saying, "Game on." Then she turned and disappeared toward the parking lot. For a long moment, I stood still, the sound of the waves pounding behind me. Something inside me tightened, not fear exactly, but recognition. Vivian never entered a room without knowing how to control it. If she was already moving pieces before the ceremony began, she had a plan. That evening, as cadets gathered for the final briefing, I barely heard the instructions. My mind was running its own reconnaissance, checking every possible outcome. Vivian had wealth connections and a public mask that fooled everyone. I had only my uniform, my record, and my composure, but sometimes those were enough. Before lights out, I scribbled a single note on the back of an old training form and tucked it into my locker. "No matter what happens tomorrow, stand tall." When the lights dimmed, thunder rolled in the distance. Rain lashed against the windows, louder now, the kind that soaked through walls. I closed my eyes, listening to it drum against the glass, and knew without question tomorrow wouldn't be calm. The morning of graduation arrived clear and cold, the kind of Rhode Island spring day that seemed to hold its breath. Flags snapped in the wind above the reviewing stand as the Navy band tuned its brass instruments. Rows of white uniforms gleamed in the sun. I could smell salt from the bay and the faint tang of polished metal from the chairs lined for the guests. I told myself to breathe, to let the precision of the ceremony steady me. When the announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers calling each new officer's name, the rhythm was perfect. Step forward, salute, shake hands, return to formation. I waited for my turn, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then came my name, Ensign Morgan Hale. Applause. I stepped forward, heels in sync with the beat of the snare drum. The sunlight hit my insignia like a spark. I caught sight of Vivian in the front row. She was radiant in a cream suit and dark sunglasses, a small smile playing on her lips as if she owned this moment. For one strange heartbeat, I thought maybe she had come in peace. Then her expression shifted tight around the mouth, jaw set. The next second shattered everything. The scrape of metal against concrete cut through the music. She had stood, hands gripping the chair beside her. I remember the sound before the motion, the chair leg dragging the collective gasp as she lifted it, her voice slicing the air. "You ungrateful little thief!" Then impact. A burst of white light. The chair struck my shoulder and glanced off my head. Pain exploded through my skull, sharp and hot, followed by the echo of the crash as it hit the stage. My body wanted to fall, but years of training held me upright. The crowd erupted in noise, shouting, screaming, chairs toppling. I saw a child crying in the front row, a captain rushing forward, MPs sprinting toward Vivian. She was yelling incoherently, words lost in the chaos. Cameras flashed. Someone's phone dropped. My vision blurred at the edges and the world tilted sideways, but my instincts cut through the haze. "Stand your ground. Control the situation." When the first MP reached me, I lifted a hand. "Don't arrest her yet. Isolate the threat." My voice was steady, even as blood traced down the side of my face. The MPs hesitated, then followed orders. They surrounded Vivian, guiding her away, while she continued to shout that I had stolen her husband's legacy. She didn't realize the microphones around the platform were still live. Every word carried through the speakers and across the parade ground. You think wearing that uniform makes you better than me? You're nothing without Richard's money." Her words were knives, but the real wound was deeper. The humiliation of knowing hundreds of officers, cadets, and guests were witnessing my private history explode in public. I could hear the click of camera shutters, the faint whir of a recording drone circling above. Someone yelled for medical. I stood there, every muscle trembling with the effort to remain still. I wouldn't let her see me broken. Not her, not anyone. I adjusted my cap, squared my shoulders, and faced the crowd. The band had fallen silent, the announcer frozen. I gave one slow, deliberate salute toward the flag. It wasn't part of the script, but it was what the moment demanded. A murmur rippled through the audience, then applause, hesitant, confused, but growing. I felt the sting of sweat and blood running together, the metallic taste in my mouth, but I held the salute until the last clap faded. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. The MPs escorted Vivian out, her voice still echoing in fragments. She was yelling about betrayal, about inheritance, about ghosts. The wind carried her words away. When they finally disappeared beyond the gate, the noise began to dissolve into uneasy whispers. The Admiral stepped forward, his face pale but composed, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Ensign Hale, let's get you to medical." I nodded, but my knees were beginning to give. As they guided me down from the platform, flashes continued from the press section. Later, I would learn that one of those cameras caught the exact moment I refused to fall. The clip would circulate online within hours under the caption, "The calmest Navy officer I've ever seen." At that time, I didn't care about videos or headlines. I cared about breathing through the pain and not letting the darkness pull me under. Inside the base infirmary, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. A medic cleaned the wound near my temple, murmuring that it would need stitches. I sat there, uniform stained with blood, gloves ruined, and stared at my reflection in the glass cabinet. The face looking back wasn't one I recognized, steady, expressionless eyes, cold with something close to resolve. A nurse asked if I wanted to press charges. I said quietly, "She attacked a Navy officer on federal ground. The system will handle her." My words sounded mechanical, but inside something else was shifting. The shock was fading, replaced by a low, burning certainty. Vivian had crossed into my world now, a world governed by structure and accountability, not manipulation or charm. There would be consequences. As I left the infirmary, the parade ground was empty. The chairs lay scattered, a few still overturned. The ocean wind had picked up, lifting bits of confetti and flags that had fallen during the chaos. I walked to the edge of the platform, looked out at the bay, and let the silence wash over me. The pain in my shoulder pulsed with every heartbeat, but beneath it was something sharper clarity. I understood what this meant. The humiliation, the blood, the shattered moment of pride, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning she had invited without realizing it. I pressed a hand over the bandage on my head and whispered to myself, "You wanted an audience, Vivian. You just got one you can't control." 3 days after the ceremony, Newport was still buzzing like a hive that had been kicked. The local papers couldn't get enough of it. Every newsstand from Providence to Boston carried the same headline with only slight variations: "Stepfamily drama erupts at Navy graduation." Some called it an outburst, others called it a scandal. None of them called it what it really was: a crime on federal property. I stayed on base, confined to quarters under medical observation. The doctor said I had a mild concussion, but the physical ache was nothing compared to the noise outside. My phone filled with messages from reporters requesting comments. I ignored every one. The Navy's Public Affairs Office had already given me a direct order: no statements to media until investigation concludes. So I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, but silence didn't mean surrender. It was strategy. On the third morning, I sat alone in my quarters uniform, jacket folded neatly beside me, laptop open to the security footage from the ceremony. Someone from Event Logistics had forwarded it to me unofficially. The recording began with the sound of the band, bright and ceremonial, then the chaos, then the chair. Watching it again made my stomach twist, not from pain, but from anger, the calm kind, the kind that plans instead of reacts. I froze the frame where Vivian's face contorted mid-swing. I zoomed in and saw what I hadn't noticed before. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me as if following a cue. Someone had signaled her. That detail lodged in my mind like a nail. By noon, my commanding officer, Captain Raymer, called me into his office. His tone was clipped, but not unkind. Ensign Hale, the Navy, and NCIS have initiated an internal review. You'll cooperate fully and you'll refrain from public comment. Understood? I nodded. He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, you handled yourself with dignity out there. Not many would have." I saluted, but inside, I was already thinking ahead. If Vivian had come on base, she hadn't done it alone. She would have needed authorization. Someone had vouched for her access. That was my first lead. That evening, the official notice arrived. Vivian Hale was being summoned for questioning under suspicion of assault on a federal officer and unauthorized access to military installation. The words looked almost poetic in their precision. For the first time in my life, I saw the system moving in my favor. Still, bureaucracy was slow, and Vivian was cunning. I couldn't count on justice to find its way unaided. So while the Navy handled the paperwork, I gathered proof. I requested the visitor registration log from the event, pretending it was for personal records. It showed Vivian entered at 0800 hours, 2 hours before the ceremony, under a sponsor name I didn't recognize, Colonel Harris, my father's old colleague. That explained the access, but raised new questions. Why would a retired officer risk his reputation for her? When I called the base's security office to confirm, they said Harris had indeed signed her in, but claimed he was doing a favor for an old family friend. I printed everything entry log footage and a copy of the email confirming her attendance, and kept them in a locked drawer. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The next morning, I was introduced to my assigned JAG representative, Lieutenant Daniel Reeves. He was younger than I expected, early 30s, clean-cut, with the calm of someone who knew the rules better than most. He shook my hand firmly. "Ensign Hale, I've read the initial report. This case isn't just assault. There's intent. The fact that it happened on base elevates it." I studied him for a moment, unsure whether to trust him yet. He read the hesitation in my silence. "Look, I'm not here to make headlines," he said. "I'm here to make sure she doesn't walk away with a slap on the wrist." That was enough for me. Over the next few hours, Daniel and I went through every piece of evidence. He noticed things I hadn't: the angle of the thrown chair, the open microphone that caught her exact words, and the pattern of her arrival timing that matched the break between security sweeps. "She knew the schedule," he murmured. "Someone briefed her." His eyes met mine. This wasn't impulsive. The idea chilled me. I had assumed Vivian lost control, but Daniel was right. She had planned it. Maybe not the exact moment, but the symbolism of it. Humiliate me in front of the Navy, destroy the image of the disciplined daughter she had always despised. By evening, the story had spread to national outlets. A clip from the ceremony appeared on TikTok, then on Twitter. Within 48 hours, it had over 1 million views. The caption read, "Navy officer attacked by stepmother during graduation still stands at attention." Comments poured in. "This woman deserves a medal. That stepmother needs to be locked up. Discipline under fire." It should have comforted me, but it didn't. Fame was noise, and noise attracts attention from places you can't control. That night, I received another anonymous message. "Stop pushing it. You'll regret this." The same words, new number. My pulse jumped, but I didn't reply. Instead, I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Daniel. He called within minutes. "You've received multiple threats." "2," I said. "Could be her, could be someone trying to scare me." His voice sharpened. "Either way, we'll escalate it. NCIS will trace the origin." The next morning, NCIS agents arrived on base to take my statement. They were efficient, quiet, and thorough. One of them, Special Agent Keller, had the expression of someone who had seen too many families self-destruct. He asked me to recount everything from the moment I received the guest confirmation email to the instant I blacked out. When I finished, he closed his notebook. "You handled yourself well, Ensign. This will go beyond a simple assault charge." Later that day, Vivian's attorney issued a public statement. Mrs. Hale acted in a moment of emotional distress after years of family estrangement. She regrets the incident. I read it aloud and laughed. Emotional distress, as if she had tripped into the chair by accident. The Navy didn't buy it. The following morning, Vivian was officially charged under Title 18, Section 111 of the U.S. Code, assaulting a federal officer, maximum penalty 8 years. Despite the progress, the atmosphere on base grew tense. Some officers treated me like a symbol, others like a walking headline. I wanted neither. All I wanted was truth. I met Daniel in the legal office that evening. He laid out the situation bluntly. Her defense will claim diminished capacity may be temporary insanity, but if we prove planning those messages, her early arrival, her access card, it becomes premeditated. He paused. That's federal prison time. I nodded slowly. Then we prove it. That night alone in my quarters, I replayed everything in my mind. The sound of the chair scraping the ground, her voice calling me a thief, the metallic taste of blood mixed with salt air. Each detail was carved into memory, but underneath the anger was something new: resolve. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to Vivian. I was responding, strategically calmly within the system she believed she could manipulate. 2 days later, I attended a briefing with Captain Raymer and NCIS to finalize my deposition. As I walked through the corridor, other officers stepped aside, offering quiet nods. Not pity, but respect. It was strange how quickly scandal turned into legend. The Navy loved its stories of composure under fire, even when the fire came from a family feud. When I returned to my quarters that evening, a small envelope waited on my desk. No return address, just my name typed in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No message, only a printed screenshot of the video, still me standing tall, blood streaking down my temple. Across the bottom, handwritten in red ink, were 4 words. You should have stayed quiet. My breath caught, but I smiled. Fear had long since lost its grip. I folded the paper neatly, slid it into a folder labeled Evidence, and locked it away with the rest. Then I sat down, opened my notebook, and began drafting a timeline of every contact Vivian had before the ceremony. I wasn't going to let intimidation decide the narrative. Not this time. Outside, the wind howled off the Atlantic, rattling the windows. Somewhere beyond the darkness, I imagined her pacing her luxury apartment, calling lawyers, spinning stories. But this wasn't her stage anymore. The system had taken notice, and so had I. For years, she had used silence as a weapon. Now, it was mine. Would you have stayed silent? Or fought back? The JAG office at Newport was a place that smelled of paper coffee and quiet authority. Its walls were lined with framed flags and citation symbols of rules that had built an entire world on order. I sat across from Lieutenant Daniel Reeves at a long oak table. Our laptops opened the faint hum of fluorescent lights above us. The base outside was calm again. Drills resumed the world pretending to move on. But inside that office, nothing felt settled. Daniel's tone was measured as he read the preliminary report from NCIS. Vivian Hale gained access using a sponsor credential from retired Colonel Harris. He denies knowledge. I stared at the name. Harris, my father's friend. The man who gave the toast at their wedding 20 years ago. He had been like an uncle when I was a child, all charm and whiskey-scented advice. The idea that he had vouched for her made my jaw tighten. He's lying, I said quietly. He wouldn't have signed her in without knowing. Daniel tapped his pen against the desk. Or maybe he owed her a favor. Either way, we'll find out. We spent the next several hours combing through the visitor logs. Every detail mattered. The base required that each civilian guest provide identification clearance reason and sponsor signature. Vivian's entry form was time-stamped 07:58 a.m., 2 hours before the ceremony began. The sponsor signature, C. Harris. The guard's initials matched. Daniel leaned forward. The problem is retired officers sometimes retain base access privileges. If he used his ID, it would have seemed legitimate. He paused. But what she did after entering makes him complicit if he knew her intent. I watched the footage again frame by frame. At 08:03, the camera by Gate B showed Harris standing near the visitor kiosk. A few minutes later, Vivian's car entered. She waved at him. He nodded. There, I said. He didn't just sign her in. He met her. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's enough to open a military access protocol violation. If NCIS confirms he knowingly sponsored her for personal motives, he's finished. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for Harris. Almost. He had chosen the wrong side of history. We assembled everything: timestamps, logs, video stills, and audio transcripts from the graduation's live mic. Daniel was meticulous labeling each piece of evidence, building the skeleton of a case that was becoming larger than either of us had expected. "You understand," he said, glancing up from his notes. "This isn't just about an assault. It's about integrity of base security. That puts it under federal jurisdiction." His tone carried a mixture of warning and respect. I nodded. "Good," I said. "Then she'll finally learn that wealth can't buy her way out of a uniformed system." By mid-afternoon, we filed a formal incident report to the Office of the Judge Advocate General. Every form had its own language dates, codes, statutes. But each word carried weight. I had learned long ago that in the Navy, truth didn't shout. It documented. The real power wasn't in emotion. It was in precision. While Daniel coordinated with NCIS, I reached out to the public affairs officer to secure the original event footage before it could be edited or leaked further. When the technician handed me the hard drive, he whispered, "For what it's worth, ma'am, everyone's talking about your composure that day." I thanked him, but inside I felt nothing heroic. I hadn't stayed calm for applause. I had stayed calm because anger gave her power. Silence gave me control. That evening, Daniel returned from a call with NCIS, his expression sharpened. "Harris is cooperating, but he's nervous. He admits he signed her in, but claims she said it was a surprise reconciliation. He says he didn't know she planned anything." I studied Daniel's face. "You believe him?" He shrugged. "Half. He's protecting himself. But if we trace the calls between them before the event, we'll know the truth." The next morning, we met again in the same office, the walls now cluttered with printouts, timelines, and notes. Daniel outlined the next steps. "We'll send a subpoena request for Harris's phone records and cross-reference with Vivian's. If they coordinated, NCIS will nail it down." He looked at me carefully. "Once that happens, her legal team will retaliate. Be prepared for personal attacks." He wasn't wrong. 2 days later, a courier arrived at the JAG office with a letter from Vivian's attorney. It was printed on embossed stationery thick enough to feel like arrogance in paper form. I unfolded it. The message was short. "Our client intends to pursue civil action for defamation, character damage, and emotional distress resulting from Ensign Hale's public conduct." I read it aloud, and Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Defamation," he said dryly. "She assaulted you on camera." I smiled faintly. "She's not suing to win. She's suing to intimidate." I slipped the letter into my folder and said, "If she wants a war, she's chosen the wrong battlefield." We worked late that night, tracing every path that led Vivian onto the base. The more we uncovered, the clearer her intent became. She hadn't acted on impulse. She had built an opportunity. The timing of her entry, the seat location front row center, directly facing the stage, all coordinated. Daniel tapped one of the documents. "Notice this line," he said. "She was cleared as VIP guest, family of honoree. That designation bypasses secondary screening." He looked up. "That's how she smuggled through." My pulse quickened. "So the system she manipulated will now be what exposes her." We compiled a comprehensive brief and sent it to NCIS headquarters by encrypted transmission. The file included everything: the chair footage, the base logs, Harris's signature, and her attorney's intimidation letter. It wasn't just a case file anymore. It was a story of control versus accountability. The next morning, an NCIS agent called to confirm receipt. "Ensign Hale, we'll handle the rest from here. Stay available for testimony." His voice was firm, professional. I thanked him and hung up. When I looked across the table, Daniel was watching me with that calm, analytical gaze of his. "You realize," he said quietly, "your restraint that day may end up being the strongest evidence in this entire case." I thought about it. The still image of me saluting blood on my temple had become something viral, a symbol people were projecting their own meaning onto. To me, it wasn't a performance. It was survival. But in a courtroom, perception becomes truth, and calm becomes credibility. Later that afternoon, Daniel forwarded an email from NCIS Intelligence. They had pulled phone logs. 2 calls from Vivian to Harris the night before the ceremony, one lasting 11 minutes, another 3. They also found a third number linked to a private security firm in Providence. "Private security," Daniel muttered. She hired someone to scout the venue. My stomach turned. Then she knew exactly where I'd be. It was no longer a family incident. It was an orchestrated humiliation. I walked out of the JAG office and stood by the waterfront, the bay rippling under the pale light. The wind carried the sound of training drills from a distance, voices shouting, cadence boots striking pavement. It reminded me why I was here, why this mattered. I wasn't fighting Vivian for revenge. I was fighting for boundaries, mine, my father's memory, and the line between personal chaos and institutional order. When I returned, Daniel was still at his desk reviewing a list of potential witnesses. He looked up and said, "We'll build this the right way. No shortcuts. That's what separates us from her." His words carried weight. Vivian had always believed rules were for other people. Now the rules would be what undid her. The following week, NCIS formally opened the second phase of investigation breach of military access protocol. Colonel Harris was temporarily suspended from his advisory role. The media picked up the story again this time with a new headline, "Base Security Under Review After Navy Assault." Vivian's name was back in the spotlight, but this time not as a socialite, as a suspect. That evening, I received another envelope from her lawyers, this one less formal, more desperate. It claimed I had manipulated public sentiment by refusing to correct misleading narratives. I showed it to Daniel, and he chuckled. "She's running out of ground." We stayed late again, finalizing a sworn statement for the NCIS case file. My handwriting was slow but steady as I wrote the final line. "The uniform I wear does not protect me from betrayal, but it reminds me that truth requires endurance." When I looked up, Daniel nodded approvingly. That's the line of someone who understands how to win quietly. As we shut down the office for the night, I paused by the door and looked back at the stack of files, the hard drives, the evidence that had turned humiliation into justice. For years, Vivian had used manipulation as her weapon. Now every document, every timestamp, every security log was a blade turned against her. Walking out into the cold air, I felt the first real calm since that morning on the parade ground. Not relief, just purpose. The system was moving, and this time it wasn't for her. It was for me. 2 weeks after the attack, the fog that rolled in from the Atlantic each morning seemed heavier, as if the whole of Newport was holding its breath. I had rented a small apartment downtown just off Thames Street, a place with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. It wasn't much, but it gave me distance from the base and from the whispers that followed me wherever I went. For the first time in weeks, I thought I might feel normal again. Then, the phone started ringing. It began with unknown numbers, journalists asking for comments, tabloids fishing for quotes, and then came the silence calls that hung up the second I answered. At first, I brushed it off as curiosity. Then, the pictures arrived. Someone had slid an envelope under my door. Inside were 3 printed photographs. The first showed me sitting at a cafe near Bowen's Wharf in uniform, my hand resting on a coffee cup. The second showed Lieutenant Daniel Reeves sitting across from me, leaning forward mid-conversation. The third had a red circle drawn around our hands. A single note was scrawled across the bottom. Conflict of interest. I felt the chill spread through my chest. It wasn't the photos themselves, it was what they implied. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to turn professionalism into scandal. Daniel arrived at my apartment 10 minutes after I called. He studied the photos in silence before saying, "Vivian's behind this. She's trying to smear you before the court proceedings." His jaw tightened. "These were taken from across the street. She hired someone." I nodded slowly. "She thinks if she can stain my record, the Navy will withdraw support." Daniel's tone hardened. "Not if we prove it's harassment." The next morning I was summoned to the base. The subject line of the email read, "Clarification regarding media content." I walked into the conference room where Captain Raymer and a public affairs officer were waiting. On the screen were the same photos. The officer spoke carefully. "Ensign Hale, the department received an anonymous tip alleging impropriety between you and your assigned counsel. We're obligated to verify." My pulse stayed steady. Those photos were taken in public. We were discussing case logistics. Daniel, who had been asked to attend, presented a USB drive. "These are surveillance logs from the cafe's security cameras, time-stamped. You can see our entire meeting, no misconduct, no contact beyond professional." The footage played. It showed us sitting across from each other for 40 minutes, papers on the table, leaving separately. The officer stopped the video and looked to Raymer, who sighed. That settles it. Someone's trying to bait the Navy into turning on its own. He turned to me. Be careful. The press can destroy faster than the law can defend. I nodded. I'm used to storms, sir. I just don't usually have to dodge them on land. As we left the meeting, Daniel muttered, She's escalating. When the powerful start losing control, they reach for the dirtiest tricks. His words proved true sooner than expected. That evening, my phone vibrated with another message, this time a voice memo. It was Vivian. Her tone was sharp, trembling between anger and fear. You're going to ruin this family's name, Morgan. Do you understand what you're doing? The Hales built this town. You'll destroy everything. I played it twice, then hit record on my own phone and said evenly, You already did the moment you picked up that chair. I saved both recordings. Evidence, not emotion. I was learning to treat her threats the way we treated incoming fire. Acknowledge, document, respond only through protocol. Still, unease followed me like a shadow. Late that night, I looked out my window and saw a black sedan parked across the street. No headlights, no movement. It sat there for an hour, engine idling faintly. The next night, it returned, and the night after that, the same car, the same quiet presence. On the fourth night, I walked outside, phone in hand, pretending to take a call. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the car's engine revved and pulled away. I caught a partial glimpse of the plate before it turned the corner. I wrote it down immediately. The next morning, Daniel ran the number through NCIS. It was registered to a dissolved company once owned by Vivian's real estate firm. He looked up from the file and said flatly, She's watching you. I nodded. Let her. Every time she does, she leaves another trail. Daniel filed an official complaint with NCIS under intimidation and stalking related to a federal case. Within hours, agents arrived at my apartment to set up a discreet surveillance perimeter. The senior agent Keller was calm and direct. She's trying to shake you, he said. But this is where rich people make their mistakes. They think fear works both ways. I looked out the window where the car had been. She's afraid, I said softly. Afraid of losing the only weapon she ever had control. Keller smiled faintly. Then let's take the rest from her. Over the next few days, the black sedan didn't return. But the damage was done. Vivian's desperation was unraveling into recklessness. She began calling reporters herself, framing the narrative as a misunderstanding, painting herself as the grieving widow manipulated by her husband's daughter. The public wasn't buying it. Comment sections were brutal. You don't throw a chair at someone you love. Arrest her already. For every story she tried to spin, 3 more dismantled it. The more she fought for her reputation, the faster it crumbled. But I knew better than to celebrate early. People like Vivian didn't surrender. They imploded, and sometimes they tried to take others down with them. One evening, as I walked home from base, I noticed a folded newspaper on a park bench. The headline read, Socialite faces federal charges after Navy assault. Underneath was a photo of her leaving court in sunglasses, her expression brittle. For the first time, I felt a strange mix of pity and resolve. She had spent her life climbing ladders built on appearances. Now, every rung was snapping. I returned to my apartment, locked the door, and finally allowed myself a single, deep breath. For years, she had defined my life by chaos. Now order was defining hers. The system she mocked was the same one closing in around her. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and wrote a short entry in my private log. When the powerful lose control, they call it tragedy. When the disciplined endure, they call it justice. I closed the screen, turned off the light, and listened to the wind outside. Somewhere out there, Vivian was still fighting ghosts, but this time the silence belonged to me. They summoned me to JAG headquarters in Washington the morning after Daniel called with a voice that sounded like he'd been up all night. The drive down I-95 blurred under a sky the color of pewter. The city felt different from Newport, bigger, sterner, full of institutions that could swallow private chaos and translate it into precedent. The JAG building smelled of coffee and paper and a kind of official quiet that comforted me more than I expected. Daniel met me in the lobby, briefcase in hand, eyes sharper than usual. He led me through a corridor where portraits of past judge advocates watched over us like stern relatives. They pulled a feed from a secondary camera, he said, without preamble as we walked. Not the one everyone saw on the podium. This one is a side angle near the VIP entrance. It caught more than the throw. My heart started a slow drum. I'd watched the viral clip a dozen times. I had seen the chair arc and heard the crowd and tasted blood. But the idea of another camera, another perspective, filled me with equal parts dread and hope. Inside a small conference room, Daniel sat me down and tapped a file. He connected his laptop to the screen and pressed play. The footage started with a mundane shot of the VIP seating area, people shifting in their chairs, program pamphlets fluttering, a toddler tugging at a shoe. Then it cut to Vivian stepping into frame with that practiced glide of her sunglasses low, smiling at those she knew. The camera caught her looking not at me, but at someone beyond the camera's edge, and then in a moment that felt like an inevitability, she picked up the folding chair. The angle was unmistakable. Vivian's hand curled around the metal, and her mouth formed words that the live mic had missed in the frenzy. The audio track on this feed was clearer. Daniel hit the audio enhancement filter, and the room fell silent except for the hiss of the speakers. Her voice, precise and low, threaded through the recording like a needle. "If I can't destroy you privately, I'll do it publicly." The sound landed in my chest as if someone had punched me, but the punch wasn't pain, it was confirmation. Confirmation that this had not been a breaking point brought on by grief or confusion. It had been a plan. I felt both the weight and the release of that truth. Tears came then, not from fear, but from something closer to relief. Relief that the last shadow of doubt was finally lit. I didn't try to hide them. Daniel gave me a minute, leaning back, his face a study in professional quiet. "We'll chain this to the rest," he said. "This makes the narrative clear. Premeditation on base. Access violation. Threats. It's all connected." The rest of the day unfolded in a way I'd been preparing for and dreading. Daniel and I compiled a supplemental brief to NCIS and the JAG prosecution team, attaching the newly unearthed footage, the audio transcript, and a cross-referenced timeline that matched Vivian's calls, Harris's entries, and the private security firm's scouting reports. The file left with a secure transmission and an acknowledgement that smelled, to my relief, like forward motion. By late afternoon, the media landscape shifted in a way that felt almost cinematic. Reporters who'd once speculated about family drama now spun headlines that centered on a service member's dignity and the sanctity of military space. Navy officer assaulted at graduation. New footage suggests premeditation, read one headline. Another wire ran with "From socialite to suspect how entitlement crossed a federal line." The tone of the public conversation turned. Comments I'd skimmed earlier about courage and discipline now multiplied into threads that debated access protocols, the risks of private vendettas on federal property, and the concept of accountability for the wealthy. It was strange to see my personal humiliation reframed as civic concern, but I didn't resent it. If the conversation could make it harder for anyone to weaponize ceremony against another human being, then it had value beyond my story. That evening, as dusk eased over the city, my phone rang. The caller ID read Chief Karen Brooks. I had met her briefly during a high-level briefing at Newport. She was a legend among senior enlisted, the kind of leader whose steady voice had steadied more than one ship in rough seas. I answered on the second ring. "Ensign Hale," she said, and there was a warmth that didn't undercut authority. "I don't want to make this about me. I'm calling because I want you to know you're not alone." I heard paperwork shuffling in the background, the sound of a woman carrying institutional weight and making a choice to use it for a person. Karen's voice was direct. "You handled yourself with honor. That matters more in our service than any speech. Don't let the noise make you forget that." I swallowed because the gratitude that rose in me was inconvenient and human. "Thank you, Chief," I said. "I'm just doing what I can." She chuckled softly. "You did what you had to. We'll handle the rest." The force pays attention to its own. She paused, and then in a quieter tone she added, "If they need witness testimony from someone who's seen the inside of the Court of Enlisted Review, I'll be there." Sometimes the presence of a steady voice changes the tenor of a case more than lawyering does. Her offer felt like armor. Over the next days, allies surfaced in unexpected places. A lieutenant commander from administrative oversight offered to fast-track the chain of custody documentation. A civilian prosecutor with experience in federal property crimes consulted pro bono. Local veterans groups issued statements that framed the assault as an affront not only to me, but to every officer who served. Daniel coordinated interviews for witnesses who'd been seated near Vivian and NCIS, interviewed a private security guard who admitted to being hired to observe the ceremony on behalf of a client aligned with Vivian. Piece by piece, the mosaic formed around a central truth. This had been orchestration, not accident, and the orchestration had violated the trust of the base itself. The public's outrage became a kind of pressure valve. People wanted institutions to act when private power tried to override public safety. That pressure translated into legal bandwidth. NCIS expedited certain requests, and federal prosecutors signaled interest in pursuing the broader violations alongside assault charges. I watched it all from a small office in jag hands folded, feeling simultaneously small and enormous. Small because my life had been split by a single act of violence. Enormous because that rupture had touched a network of systems designed to do one thing: enforce order. When I thought about it in quiet moments, I saw the irony. Vivian had picked the public stage expecting spectacle and applause. Instead, she'd triggered the mechanisms that keep institutions impartial. The very visibility she sought became the thing that undid her. That realization felt like a strange kind of justice. It wasn't catharsis so much as recognition, an understanding that rules and witnesses, when marshaled, create consequences that even money can't bribe away. I sat back in the chair and let the fact settle. The allies who had rallied around me were not there because I was famous. They were there because someone had crossed a line, and systems are built to respond when civility collapses into coercion. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, steadied my breath, and looked up at Daniel. "Let them try," I said softly. "Let them see what the uniform means." He nodded, and in his eyes I saw the weary satisfaction of someone who knew the law could be more relentless than malice. Outside, Washington's lights blinked like constellations of small, indifferent promises. Inside, the unseen recordings had changed everything. The allies were organized, the evidence stacked, and the system finally was listening. By August, the heat in Providence hung thick over the courthouse steps, and the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. The federal court was a granite monument to order, its marble floors echoing the footsteps of lawyers, officers, and journalists crowding for the hearing that had grown from a local scandal into a national story. Reporters lined the steps, microphones ready, cameras trained on the doors. Inside, the air was cold from overworked air conditioning. The seal of the United States hung above the bench, the flags behind it motionless. I sat in the first row behind the prosecution's table, the gold trim on my Navy uniform catching stray reflections of the fluorescent lights. Vivian entered, surrounded by her legal team, 3 attorneys in dark suits and a cloud of perfume that smelled like old money. She wore a black dress, modest and deliberate pearls at her throat. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her face composed into the portrait of a misunderstood woman. She avoided my eyes as she took her seat at the defense table. The gallery murmured. Daniel sat beside me, crisp in his uniform, a quiet force. "She's going to try to make it look like an accident," he whispered, "or an emotional breakdown, but the footage will bury that." When the judge entered, the room fell into the kind of silence that carried weight. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, and everybody in the room obeyed. Judge Bennett, stern and measured, took his place behind the bench. "This court is now in session for the case of the United States versus Vivian Hale." The charge sheet was read aloud: assault on a federal officer, trespassing on a military installation, and associated violations of federal protocol. Each word sounded like a drumbeat, marking the distance between what she was and what she pretended to be. Vivian's lead attorney stood silver-haired and articulate, and launched into his opening statement. He painted her as a grieving widow, a woman undone by the pressure of loss and the cruelty of estrangement. My client's outburst, he said, was an act of human emotion, not criminal intent. She was provoked by years of misunderstanding by a stepdaughter who publicly rejected her. This was not malice. This was heartbreak. Daniel leaned closer and muttered, "He's rehearsed sympathy as strategy." Then he stood for the prosecution. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried across the room with the kind of precision only a JAG officer could wield. This case, he said, is not about grief. It is about control. The defendant entered a federal installation without proper authorization, waited until a nationally recorded ceremony, and assaulted a newly commissioned officer in uniform. This wasn't family tension. It was premeditated assault on a U.S. Navy officer. The room stirred a ripple of unease cutting through the gallery. The first witnesses were called base security officers, event coordinators, and a Marine MP who had restrained Vivian that day. Each confirmed the same timeline: her early arrival, her position in the front row, the unprovoked outburst. When the footage was played on the courtroom's large monitor, the sound of the chair scraping against concrete filled the room, followed by her words. The camera zoomed in on the moment of impact. A collective gasp passed through the gallery. The video switched to the secondary footage recovered by NCIS, the angle that captured her whisper before the attack. "If I can't destroy you privately, I'll do it publicly." The sentence hung in the courtroom like smoke. Vivian's lawyer tried to object, citing emotional prejudice, but the judge overruled him. "The statement establishes intent," Judge Bennett said. "It stays." The silence that followed was absolute. On the screen, I watched myself, blood streaking down my temple posture, straight saluting. The image that had gone viral was now evidence: a uniformed officer bleeding and refusing to fall. I could hear someone in the back of the courtroom whisper, "That's her." For the first time since the ceremony, I looked at that version of myself without flinching. The humiliation had turned into proof. Daniel questioned each witness with surgical precision, dismantling the defense's narrative, one polite phrase at a time. When he cross-examined Colonel Harris, the retired officer who had signed Vivian onto the base, his tone hardened. "Colonel, did you sign the visitor access form for Mrs. Hale?" Harris's voice faltered. "Yes." "Did she tell you her purpose?" "She said it was a surprise visit for reconciliation." "Did she mention bringing a camera crew or security consultant?" Harris hesitated, sweat beading along his collar. "No." "Yet records show she contacted a private security firm 24 hours prior to the event." Harris swallowed. I wasn't aware." Daniel pressed. "Would you describe authorizing a civilian with a known conflict into a secured Navy installation as responsible conduct?" The courtroom was silent. Harris's answer was barely audible. "No, sir." By midday, the weight of evidence felt immovable. NCIS agents presented the recovered messages from Vivian's phone. The anonymous threats sent to me traced to a prepaid number purchased near her office. They showed bank records linking her to the security contractor who had scouted the venue. The judge took notes, steadily unblinking. Vivian sat, rigid fingers clenching her pearl necklace, the mask of composure cracking by degrees. Her attorney tried once more to redirect, calling her to the stand. When she spoke, her voice trembled with a kind of theatrical fragility. "I never meant to hurt her," she said, eyes glistening. "She provoked me. She embarrassed me. She stole what was rightfully mine." The last sentence broke whatever sympathy might have lingered. Daniel rose slowly. What exactly did she steal Mrs. Hale? Her father's approval? His estate? His legacy? Or was it the spotlight? She looked at him, face tightening. "You wouldn't understand," she hissed. "I raised her." Daniel replied evenly. "No. You controlled her. There's a difference." When he finished, the courtroom was silent again, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. The prosecution rested its case. The defense called no further witnesses. The judge recessed for 30 minutes before delivering the verdict. I sat, unmoving, eyes fixed on the marble seal above the bench, feeling the slow return of breath I hadn't realized I was holding. When the judge returned, his voice was steady and final. "The court finds the defendant Vivian Hale guilty on all counts: assault on a federal officer and trespassing on a military installation." He paused as the murmurs spread. "Sentenced to 18 months imprisonment, followed by 3 years of probation, and ordered to pay a civil fine of $150,000. His gavel came down a single sharp crack that echoed through the chamber like closure itself. Vivian slumped in her chair, eyes glassy disbelief flickering into panic. The guards moved toward her, but before they let her out, she looked at me for the first time. There was no hatred left in her face, only confusion, the confusion of someone who had spent her life writing the rules, suddenly realizing they applied to her too. I stood smoothing the crease in my uniform and stepped forward. The words came out low and calm, every syllable deliberate. This uniform doesn't make me better than you. It reminds me I'll never stoop as low. She flinched as if struck by something invisible. As the bailiff led her away, cameras flashed from the back of the courtroom, reporters scribbling notes. I didn't look at them. I looked at Daniel, who gave a single nod, the kind that said quietly, "We did it right." Outside, the summer sun hit the courthouse steps, blinding and hot. A crowd waited with questions I had no intention of answering. Justice doesn't need commentary. It needs witnesses. That night, I returned to my apartment, placed my hat on the table, and stared at the reflection in the window. The city lights blurred across the glass, but my own image was steady. The noise would fade, the headlines would pass, but the moment inside that courtroom would not. It would live not as spectacle, but as proof of what happens when discipline outlasts deceit. Would you have forgiven her, or watched her fall? 1 month after the verdict, the ripples of the trial were still spreading like oil on calm water. Providence had moved on to new headlines, but the ones that remained carried my name in smaller print and Vivian's in larger, heavier type. The words always came paired: conviction, fraud, revocation, disgrace. She had been sentenced to 18 months, but the legal aftershocks went further. Civil court froze her remaining assets pending review of financial misconduct tied to my father's estate. The trust she had so carefully weaponized was now being dismantled clause by clause until it became clear she had abused her power of attorney years before. I didn't follow every hearing, but the summaries trickled in through the Navy legal network. Her control over the property's investments and even the family foundation she'd once chaired was gone. It was ironic she had tried to break me publicly, and now every layer of her private empire was being peeled back under fluorescent light. The press framed the story as poetic justice. One magazine published a long-form feature titled "Justice Through Discipline: The Ensign Who Stood Tall." They called me the face of composure in crisis, a modern symbol of institutional integrity. I read it once and set it aside. I wasn't interested in heroism. The article didn't mention the sleepless nights or the way the sound of metal scraping still woke me. It didn't describe the moment I realized silence could hum louder than any shout. Public admiration was its own kind of noise, and I didn't need more of that. After the trial, the Navy transferred me to Norfolk Naval Station for temporary reassignment. The email came from Personnel Command, neat and formal. Effective immediately. Ensign Hale will assume administrative coordination duties under fleet operations pending reassessment. It wasn't a demotion or a promotion, just movement. A quiet acknowledgement that after the storm, I needed new waters. Daniel stopped by my quarters before I left Newport, dropping an envelope on my desk. Inside was a letter of commendation signed by Captain Raymer. It cited exceptional composure under threat and exemplary representation of service values. A few weeks later, a second memo arrived from the Office of the Chief of Naval Personnel approving a temporary rank advancement to lieutenant junior grade. The promotion felt almost abstract. Titles didn't fix bruises. But when I stood in the mirror adjusting the new insignia, I caught myself exhaling for the first time in months. Norfolk was bigger, busier, louder. The constant rhythm of ships docking, cranes lifting, and jets slicing the sky filled the days with motion. It was the kind of environment that erased reflection if you let it. I didn't. Every evening I walked to the pier after duty hours the same way I used to pace the Newport docks. The sea smelled different here, more oil, less salt, but it still reminded me that distance could heal in small increments. Then one quiet afternoon, an envelope arrived at my new office. It was plain, addressed by hand. No return label, just a faint stamp from the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury. I knew before opening it. Vivian's handwriting was unmistakable, looped perfect, the kind of penmanship taught in prep schools and preserved like armor. I hesitated before tearing it open. Inside the letter was short, 4 sentences written on lined paper. "You ruined me, but maybe you saved me. I think about that day every night. The silence afterward hurts worse than the cell walls. Don't worry, I won't write again." I read it twice, then folded it and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel sorry either. What I felt was distance vast and final, the kind that separates two people not just by bars, but by entirely different understandings of the world. She had spent her life mistaking control for love, and when control was stripped away, all that remained was emptiness. I wasn't going to fill it for her. That night, after evening colors, I sat at my desk and pulled out a donation form for the Naval Family Support Foundation, a fund that provided aid to children affected by guardianship abuse and domestic violence. I filled it out in silence, designating a percentage of my monthly salary to go directly to their Protective Services Division. It wasn't charity, it was reclamation. For years, Vivian had used money to dominate people. Now, a part of her fortune through court restitution was funding an organization that rebuilt others from what she'd destroyed. I decided I would match whatever the court recovered. Some wounds needed a counterweight measured not in anger, but in redirection. That weekend, I returned to the pier. The Norfolk air carried traces of diesel and brine, the wind tugging at my hair as gulls screamed overhead. The sun was lowering, gilding the surface of the water. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished navy pin I had worn the day of the ceremony, the one stained faintly with dried blood. I'd kept it in a velvet pouch inside my desk, untouched, since the trial ended. Holding it now felt like holding a fragment of both pain and proof. I sat at the edge of the dock legs dangling above the rolling tide. For a long time, I said nothing. The quiet felt earned. Around me, sailors shouted orders, cranes groaned, waves slapped against hulls, but it all sounded far away. I ran my thumb over the edge of the pin until the metal warmed against my skin. There had been a time I thought I'd throw it away, that the sight of it would always carry humiliation. But sitting there, I realized it had become something else entirely. The blood wasn't shame, it was testament. The line between dignity and destruction was thin, but I had stayed on the right side of it. Somewhere behind me, a ship's horn sounded low and resonant, rolling across the bay like memory. I looked out at the horizon and imagined my father standing on some metaphorical shore, nodding in quiet approval. Maybe he had believed in Vivian once. Maybe he'd been blind to her cruelty. But I chose to think that if he were alive, he would understand now. He had raised me to salute the flag, not surrender to fear. That had been his legacy all along, buried beneath her manipulation, but never truly gone. As twilight bled into night, I stood and tucked the pin back into my pocket. The horizon glowed faintly with the lights of passing ships. The future felt vast and unclaimed like the ocean at low tide. Behind me, the base lights flickered on one by one, anchoring the shoreline in gold. I turned toward them, the sound of the waves steady underfoot. The cost of control I thought was always the same. For Vivian, it had been freedom. For me, it had been innocence. But only one of us had learned that letting go was its own kind of victory. I touched the bandage-thin scar at my hairline and whispered into the wind, "You lost the game the moment you thought I was still playing it." The sea answered with a rush against the pier, indifferent and eternal. When I walked back toward the barracks, the night air tasted of salt and closure. Tomorrow would bring more orders, more forms, more duties, but none of it would feel heavy. Justice, I had learned, doesn't end in a courtroom. It echoes quietly through choices made after. The kind that no one films, no one claps for. The kind that belong only to the person who survived. It was late February when the knock came. Norfolk had that bleak, gray cold that sank into your bones even through the thick, Navy-issued jacket. The base was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath before spring. I had just come off a long day in logistics review when I heard it 3 deliberate knocks, too. Measured to be a neighbor, too familiar to be anyone else. For a moment, I froze in the kitchen, my coffee mug halfway to the sink. Then the voice followed, muffled but unmistakable. "Morgan, I need your help. Please, I have nowhere to go." "Vivian." Her voice had changed. It was thinner, as if prison had scraped off its confidence and left behind something raw. I set the mug down and walked to the door, each step echoing against the tile. I didn't open it. I pressed my palm flat against the cool metal, feeling the vibration of her breathing on the other side. "How did you find this address?" I asked, my voice steady. She let out a brittle laugh that dissolved into something like a sob. It wasn't hard. You're not hiding. I saw your name in the paper promotion commendation. You're doing so well. She paused. I'm not asking for much, just a place to stay for a few nights. The halfway house. Her voice broke the words, collapsing. They don't want me there. No one does. I stared at the deadbolt, the brass worn from years of use, and thought of all the doors she had slammed on me when I was young. The dorm I'd been locked out of when she'd refused tuition payments. The office door she'd closed in my face when I'd asked for my father's medical records. The front door of the house I'd once called home, where her voice had carried through the glass, laughing with guests, while I stood outside in the rain. Vivian, I said quietly, you had a mansion when you threw that chair. Now you have consequences. Silence followed, long and aching. Then came the sound of her knees hitting the hallway floor. You don't know what loneliness feels like, she whispered. The words cracked under their own weight. I closed my eyes. For a heartbeat, an old version of me, the one who had wanted her approval, even when it came with cruelty, almost reached for the handle. But that part of me was gone. I exhaled, my voice low but firm. I do. I just learned to use it. Through the peephole, I saw her slump against the wall. Her once perfect hair tangled, her hands shaking. Prison had taken the gloss, the jewelry, the power. All that was left was a woman facing the emptiness she had built. She cried quietly, then louder, the sound ricocheting down the corridor. I didn't move. I didn't unlock the door. Sometimes mercy is mistaken for weakness, and I couldn't afford to teach her that again. After a few minutes, the sobs quieted. Her footsteps shuffled away, slow and uncertain, until the hallway fell silent again. I stayed standing there for a while, hand still on the door, heartbeat steady. I didn't feel triumphant, just resolved. Justice isn't always a gavel. Sometimes it's a locked door and the decision not to open it. 2 days later, Daniel stopped by my office at the base. He leaned in the doorway, hat in hand. You might want to sit, he said gently. I just got a call from Providence General. I looked up from the stack of files. Vivian. He nodded. They brought her in this morning. Nervous breakdown. The doctors are calling it severe depressive collapse. She mentioned your name. He studied my face. Do you want to see her? For a long time, I didn't answer. I thought of her kneeling on the hallway floor, of the letter she'd written from prison, of the blood on my temple and the sound of metal clanging against concrete. I thought of the years she had defined control as love and fear as loyalty. No, I said finally. There's nothing left to say. Daniel nodded his eyes, understanding more than he said. You're sure? I'm sure. After he left, I walked down to the pier behind the administration building. The wind off the water was sharp, carrying the scent of cold iron and seaweed. A ship was preparing for deployment, the crew shouting in rhythm lines, coiling and uncoiling like the pulse of something eternal. I leaned on the railing, the horizon stretching endless in front of me. Somewhere out there, waves were breaking against invisible borders, erasing footprints no one would ever see. Vivian's collapse would make the news again, I knew that. They'd call it tragic, poetic, maybe even inevitable. People would pity her. Some would say I should have helped. But pity wasn't justice, and compassion wasn't the same as surrender. There are wounds you close by, walking away, not by reopening them. As the sun sank into the Atlantic painting, the sky a quiet orange, I whispered to the wind, You had your chances. The words drifted out, carried somewhere far beyond the base perimeter, maybe even toward the hospital she lay in. Maybe she'd hear them in her dreams, maybe not. Either way, the message was the same. Justice doesn't always look warm. It sometimes stands behind a closed door, breathing steady, refusing to break. It sometimes watches the tide roll in and chooses silence over sympathy. And sometimes, when the knock echoes one last time, it simply walks away. May 2024 came soft and wind-salted, the kind of morning that reminded me why sailors always spoke of the sea as something alive. The memorial was held on the main pier at Norfolk white chairs, lined in perfect symmetry beneath the flags at half-mast. The sound of waves mixed with the murmur of uniforms brushing against each other, metals glinting under a pale sun. I stood among the ranks in full dress whites, the fabric stiff, my hat precise. Around me were faces I'd known only in passing, some seasoned, some new, but all bound by the same quiet reverence. One by one, names were read of those lost in service that year. Each name was followed by a single bell strike. The sound carried across the water and faded into the wind as if the ocean itself was listening. When the ceremony ended, I felt a familiar presence at my shoulder. Daniel stood there, his uniform immaculate, his tone lighter than usual. "They've added your video," he said quietly. I turned to him puzzled. "My video." He nodded. "The graduation footage. They're using it now at OCS. A new segment in the leadership course, handling public assault with honor. Your composure under pressure. They said cadets couldn't believe you didn't flinch." He smiled faintly. "You taught them what restraint looks like." I looked back toward the horizon where the water met the sky in a thin silver seam. Maybe that day wasn't about humiliation. I said the words tasting truer now than they ever had. Maybe it was training for strength. Daniel nodded once. "You turned a wound into a lesson. That's something no one can take away." He stepped back, saluted, then walked off down the pier, leaving me with the soft hiss of the wind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old insignia pin, the same one I'd carried all this time, the one that had once been marked by blood. The metal was polished now, but a faint rust-colored trace still lingered along the edge. For a moment, I waited in my palm, the sunlight catching its surface. Then I knelt and placed it gently at the edge of the pier. The tide rose, lapped once, and claimed it. It sank slowly, swallowed by the deep. Standing there, I breathed in the salt air and felt the quiet return of something I hadn't recognized in a long time. Peace, not victory, not vengeance, just peace. In the voice of memory, I could almost hear myself a year ago whispering into the chaos. "She'll pay for it." Now I whispered something else. "She already has. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned sometimes through pain, sometimes through blood, but never by surrender." If you believe standing your ground is worth the fight, share this story. And tell me, where are you watching from?